Hey, thanks for joining us on this conference call here with the NGB Coach Educators from USA Fencing, also the U.S. Center for Coaching Excellence. And I'm really thrilled to have Daniel Coyle with us today to talk about his book, The Culture Code. And probably many of the people on here have read Culture Code, certainly read Talent Code, and many of Dan's other books. And I think that this falls into line with what a lot of us are trying to do as coaches. So, Dan, thanks for taking time out to join us.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. And, I did a lot of fencing with my brothers growing up with I can't say I know anything about fencing except everything I learned was competing with my brothers with, like, long cardboard tubes. I think we were pretty good at fencing. Maybe not as good as some of the people in your audience, though.
Maybe not. And my fencing background is pretty limited as well. I think everything I learned, unfortunately, I learned poorly from old Errol Flynn movies and The Princess Bride. Yeah. It's really funny if you ask fencing people how they got interested in fencing, because as a kid, a lot of people say Princess Bride. That and lots of Star Wars Jedi fighting as well. Yeah,
right. That's great.
And now, Daniel, a lot of folks know you because you came out here to speak to us like 8 years ago, something like that, to Colorado Springs at the training center.
That is correct. Peter Vince and some other folks had me out there, and I got to meet a really wide variety of Olympic coaches and from a wide variety of sports. I think there was even a music teacher in that room, so it was just, I remember it as an incredibly fun conversation because it cut across all domains. It wasn't like we were a swim coach or a basketball coach or a track coach. It was just all about learning, and it was just a great platform to have that conversation on. So yeah, still think about that often.
Yeah, it was enjoyable for those of us who were attending as well, and I know probably a few people on this call were there. So let me delve into this. What led you to write the Culture Code?
Well, I tell you, it came down to a tennis ball. I was visiting a Russian club named Spartak that I write about in the Talent Code. It was a tiny club that's produced many top women tennis players. And while I was there was a new player who showed up, a young player. She was probably 10 years old, and she showed up. It was her first day. And the head coach noticed the girl walk in the court, and went right over to her and leaned down and said, "I'm glad you're here," and said, "Can you do something for me?" And the little girl nodded, and the coach said, "Catch." And she tossed her a tennis ball, and the little girl caught it. And it was like a tiny interaction, just 10 seconds long. But in that moment, the little girl went from being an outsider to feeling connected to this place and feeling part of something bigger than her. And the way that coach did that just totally captured my imagination. Like, that is not, it didn't have anything to do with practice or information or what we would typically think of as coaching. It was about creating a culture, about connecting. And so that sort of sent me on this journey of looking at where does that feeling come from? We're all familiar with that feeling of being on a great team or having a great relationship with a coach or being connected, whether it's, in our schools or in sports or in business. And so I started going into places that had extraordinary culture, that had extraordinary high-performing cultures, and seeing what they had in common. Hello? I think I lost you.
Dan, sorry about that. I hit my mute. I hit my mute button and forgot to unmute myself. How do you define culture, or what do you mean by culture?
I mean, if you picture an image, really, culture is a set of strong relationships moving toward a goal, toward a shared goal. When we talk about culture, a lot of times we just use it as a placeholder word for all the stuff we can't understand, and it's funny, you talk about why is that group great? Why is that group bad? And a lot of times you say, well, it's the culture. Well, it's a really vague term the way we normally use it. So when your listeners think about culture, think about like a flock of birds, all connected, all solving problems at the same moment, moving together, or maybe better even, a school of fish moving through a coral reef. Like, great cultures are connected groups of people that solve problems and that have strong relationships that allow them to behave like one big organism. That's what great cultures are. They're a bunch of people who add up to more than the sum of their parts. And so a lot of times when we look at groups, we look at the talent of the individuals, and we look at what those individuals possess. And we can't help but focus on that because that's what we see. But culture is about the interactions. It's about what takes place in that space between the individuals. When that coach tossed that tennis ball, something happened, right? And a relationship was built. And so it exists very deep in our brains, how this old wiring that we have, it's millions of years old, that lets us know when we're connected to others and when we're sharing good information with others and when we're moving toward a purpose with others. And there's sort of a deep ancient language to create that. And that's what this book is about. It's about that language of how do you create a connection? How do you share accurate information with people? And how do you move in a certain direction together?
And how did your research change how you think about culture? So you probably came into it with an idea, and after all your research, or did it change how you think about culture?
It really did, and that's a great question, Sam. It really did. I went into it thinking, man, because I visited SEAL Team 6, I visited Pixar, I visited the San Antonio Spurs, and each time I'd get kind of immersed for a few days in each of those places and those cultures. And when I went into it, I thought that great cultures were places that had everything figured out, where there wouldn't be much conflict, where everybody was kind of working together on this higher plane, right? And I could not have been more wrong. Great cultures are nice places to be, and they're addictive, and they're fun, and they're interesting. But they're places that really face into their tensions. They have hard conversations. That's what distinguishes them. That presence of that kind of hard conversation that is difficult, and that is, maybe where people are being vulnerable together. And that was the big thing that surprised me. I thought that they would be kind of invulnerable. And what I found is that they are great because they don't hide weakness. They share their weakness with each other. And that's what makes them strong. They share accurate information even when it's difficult. And that's hard to do. As human beings, we're built to protect our status, right? But these are places where, for example, the Navy SEALs were the best part of this, best example of this. After every mission, after every training run, they do something called an AAR, which is called an after-action review. And it's debriefing led by the enlisted men and women. And what it does is they say, what happened? They circle up. They get off the helicopter. They circle up right afterwards, before they sleep, before they eat. And they say, all right, what went wrong? What went right? And what are we going to do differently next time? And it's this really simple meeting, but it's also really hard to have that. It's really hard to be vulnerable and open when you just did this very hard thing together to say, hey, I think you screwed up, or I think I screwed up, or what really happened there? What really happened? Not what we hope happened or what we want to think happened. And so that kind of habit, and it's called a vulnerability loop, where two people or more are vulnerable together, and they put aside their status, and they put aside their power, and they say, what really went down right there? What happened? And that ends up being this incredible opportunity to do two things: to connect and build that relationship, and the second thing is to learn together. So you get better by being vulnerable.
One of the things I've taken from that in my other readings about SEALs is that it's also a situation where they throw rank and status out the window. It doesn't matter if you're the newest guy on the team and the lowest rank, you're the, E3 maybe, or if you're the, O2, it doesn't matter. You are all at that point equal and giving feedback to one another. So people are open to doing that. That's how I understand it.
That's exactly right. And I spent time with this guy, Dave Cooper, who trained the troops that got Bin Laden. He trained the teams that got Bin Laden. And what he taught me in the course of this is, we have this really strong authoritarian bias as human beings. And so it's not enough for leaders to say, hey, tell me the truth, or what do you really think? They have to actually behave that vulnerability. They have to constantly over-signal. Hey, look, and Dave, and tell Cooper stories in the book, went through some really, really tough times where he realized, wait a minute, I have to do more than just talk about this. I need to behave it. I need to constantly, in my language, I need to give people handholds so that they can question me And I need to always ask, what do you guys think? And I need to, actually he had a rule. You can either call me Dave, you can call me Coop, or you can call me, he actually had kind of a profane version of his name, too. Let's just call it F-Face, I think was the one he used. You can call me either of those three names, but don't call me Commander. I mean, he was a commander, but don't call me Commander. So those simple things end up sending a signal that sort of diffuses that authoritarian bias and that creates those kinds of conversations. But it's not enough to send it once. It's not enough to send it once a week. You have to see yourself as kind of a radio station, constantly sending that signal. You know, look, this is safe. Help me. You know, Dave would always, with new recruits, he would ask them, hey, if I was standing in front of a window in Fallujah, and a window's a bad place to stand in Fallujah because there are snipers. If you saw me standing in front of a window in Fallujah, what would you do? And the answer that he ended up reaching to is, I want you to push me down. Like, I want you to knock me over. Don't ask me. Don't hesitate. Do what you would do for any of your teammates. Help me. Get me out of the way of danger. So that's the kind of relationship that you have to constantly continue to build and send that signal over and over again, because we've got this bias that's just built into how we are.
Right. And in GBs, we have a hierarchy and a structure. We have coordinators, managers, directors, and such, and we can get caught up in that part as well. And it sounds like it's got to come from the top down. The CEO has to be willing to say, look, I screwed up.
You see that all the time, and it's even more. It's hard to sort of say I screwed up. That's a really important word to say, and people struggle with that a little bit because it can make you seem incompetent at times. And so one of the solutions that I've seen to that is to frame things around learning. You know, I was at Google recently, and there was an engineer there who told a story about. There were a bunch of young engineers working, and the head of Pixar, actually he worked at Pixar at the time, came in and watched them for a while. This guy's name was Ed Catmull, and he's partners with Steve Jobs, and he was the boss. And he watched these young engineers for a while, and young engineers were getting kind of nervous. The boss is watching them. And then Ed Catmull said, hey, when you guys are done, could you come up to my office and teach me how to do that? And it was just this engineer got goosebumps talking about it 15 years later, because it meant so much. And so it's not so much about saying, hey, I'm an idiot, I don't have any idea what to do. It's more about, hey, could you teach me that? And that's just an incredible way to frame and create authentic moments of vulnerability that will drive a culture.
In addition to vulnerability, what other common traits did you see across the organizations? And you mentioned you spent time at Pixar, with the San Antonio Spurs, and with the Navy SEALs, amongst others. What were some common traits that you saw in those cultures?
Tons of kind of, and it's not quite right to call them this, but tons of catchphrases. Like, they absolutely were good at distilling their culture into these really clear, slightly corny sort of catchphrases. I mean, the Navy SEALs were among the best at it. They talk all the time. Like, what do? We shoot, move, and communicate. We are the quiet professionals. The only easy day was yesterday. We do this only every day. They say all kinds of little catchphrases that help distill the culture. It's the same at this inner city school I visited. It's the same at the San Antonio Spurs. Coach Pop talks all the time about pounding the rock, and that comes from an old excerpt from a book it's a little parable. It's a story about a stone cutter who, and a passerby was going by a stone cutter who's hammering on a boulder, and he says, why are you hammering on that boulder? And the stone cutter said, because when it splits, I will not know if it is this blow or the 100 that came before. And Pop loves that story. And so he basically saturates the zone around his team with that story. He always talks about pounding the rock. He feels like that captures their identity. In the locker room is that quote, that story, that parable about the stone cutter, written in each language that the players speak, and the players on the Spurs speak about 5 different languages. So when you walk into their practice facility, what do you see? You see a rock and a hammer. Coach Pop has a wine that he sells. What's it called? It's called Rock and Hammer. So it's overdone. He does it all the time, but that's very purposeful because he constantly floods his zone with these real signals, and it's about purpose. We think that purpose comes automatically, especially in sports. We think, well, your purpose is to win the game. But that's not true. When you're creating a culture, you need to distill the character of the team into a really clear catchphrase, a saying, something that captures your values, something that captures your identity, and then flood the zone with it over and over again to give people a North Star to strive toward. And when you look at great coaches in the past, you see that they do that. You know, whether it's Vince Lombardi or Bill Walsh or John Wooden or John Kessel, to pick somebody we know. They constantly have that ability, and so in a way, that ability becomes a really important skill for coaches to develop. And it's almost like you're a composer, like you constantly have to be looking for these things, these little stories, and distilling them into kind of vivid, memorable images and flooding the zone with them to help create that sense of purpose that you see. It doesn't happen automatically. It takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of intention. And there's a great opportunity, I think, to build culture by kind of filling the windshield of your teams and your people with really clear statements of who you are and who you aren't.
Well, and you mentioned a word that I want to kind of transition into talking about the intentionality of it. And I think it's really interesting to read about the successful organizations in there, but you also mentioned a really unsuccessful and sounds highly dysfunctional when you talk about the folks in the missile silos in the Air Force. And for those who read the book, and I'll try to recap it real quick, basically they sit in a hole with a huge missile, and they run all these drills, and if they mess up, it sounded like they were just berated, like just beaten down. And the more they would beat them down, the worse their performance would get. So maybe talk about how did that intentional change come about, not only for the Missileers, but maybe for the Spurs or Pixar and these others. How intentional was that culture building, and what went into that?
Yeah, it's you know, there's this huge kind of divide, I think, in our society that we're living through, where until a few years ago, command and control, authoritarian, top-down leadership, it works. Like, fear works, you know. Cutting people if they don't make it works. It works. The challenge is that our world has changed, and that it's more competitive now, and it is more fast-moving, and there's more learning required. And so, appropriately, I think, those top-down authoritarian approaches, like you see with the Missileers, their weaknesses get exposed, and they stop working at a certain time. Fear works for a while, and then it stops working, especially with today's kind of young people. So, you know, what Coach Pop realized, you know, he actually is from the military. His background is Air Force. He realized he couldn't do that with his teams. He realized he needed to create, you know, these bonds of safety and connection, and to do that in a million different ways. And it was really cool hanging out at their practice because to see him connect with players, connect with them physically. You know, there's a player who missed a shot on the day I visited, that big shot the night before. They had lost the game. Coach Pop goes straight over to that player and starts talking about the dinner that Pop had arranged for that player that night before and the wine that Pop had ordered for that, you know, and they use food as a vehicle for connection, right, all the time. And then they went to watch film, and the film that he showed wasn't a game film. It was the film, it was a documentary on the Civil Rights Voting Act of 1964. And they started a conversation about it because he was curious. What do you guys think? What did your parents do? What, you know? So this, like, he really got to know the whole person. It was the opposite of what happens in the Missileers, where, you know, as you said, it's completely top down. If you screw up, you're out, and you're isolated in a hole. Pop is pulling people out of their isolation. He's constantly connecting and letting them know that they are connected. He's also very tough. I mean, this idea that you need to either be nice or tough is not true. He's nice and he's tough, and he's very caring and he's very high candor. But that thing, I think, is a big challenge, I think, for coaches, because many of the coaches grew up under more of a command and control, the coach as God sort of a approach. And I think what we see in modern successful cultures is there's definitely a hierarchy, like the coach is definitely in charge, but what they're doing is they're creating an atmosphere and building relationships and using shared vulnerability and using shared purpose to build cultures from the bottom up, not from the top down. And it's, it's a decision that all coaches have to make. What tools am I going to use, and what tools are going to connect with today's athletes?
And there seems to be, Steve Kerr, I would kind of seems like is in that category as well, as someone who has gone down this path versus the to bring up an older example of Bobby Knight, where you do what I say and don't question it, or I don't want really input from them. And there seems to be a cadre of coaches who are coming up who are more, I want to hear from you.
Oh man, totally. You see that in every sport, actually. Football might be the last holdout. Maybe Belichick is the last guy or the last authoritarian. But that's maybe appropriate for his sport. But yeah, your contrast you draw. Look at Steve Kerr and look at Bobby Knight. You will not find two more different human beings on the planet. And which one is successful? Kerr, because, and it's not for a moral reason. It's not that Kerr is nicer than Bobby Knight, though he probably is. It is that Kerr's tools are appropriate to this moment. Kerr is saying, I don't have all the answers. We're smarter together than I am as a group, and that's just simply true. A group of people is smarter than any individual most of the time. So the idea that one coach can have all the answers and tell people what to do it's just wrong, and it's not wrong for a moral reason. It's just wrong for a structural reason. It's 10 smart people beat one smart person every single time.
So you're talking to a lot of coach educators, at least on this live part. I don't know who will listen to the recording of the podcast. And I think there's two things that we've been looking at a lot lately and discussing. And one is, how do we change that culture of coach, particularly down at the youth sport level, where we're concerned about keeping kids active and involved in sport. And I think I'll go ahead and speak for the group here. Most of us on the big picture want that kid to have the best experience possible. If it's not in our sport, hopefully it's in another sport, but we don't want to lose them. And if they decide to go off and do band, then we at least want them to have had a good experience where they're not thinking, exercise just stinks because it just made me feel bad. And I think that's one group we're trying to do. What would be some tips? You're a parent as well, and you've written about other sports figures. But what are some things that we can do to make that change occur, to get coaches more along the lines of the Steve Kerrs and the Pops and that group to be intentional about it?
Yeah, one resource in this area is, most of your listeners probably know, but the Positive Coaching Alliance is a tremendous organization with a lot of resources that can help people build in that direction. And one of the core things that they emphasize that I would completely agree with, and that that science would completely agree with, is to really promote and support people doing a wide variety of sports. There's kind of a sports industrial complex that pushes people towards specialization. This idea that, this false idea that you need to spend 10,000 hours in one specific activity to become good is kind of driven coaches and programs, and certainly there's literally a market out there that's incentivizing specialization. And when you really look at the science and really look at who does make it in the long run, what you find is that there are athletes who did not specialize too early, who sampled a wide variety of sports until they were maybe 13 or so, and then specialized. So not only are we this idea that you need to become a young professional when you're 8 or 9, I think that is really, it's not only antithetical to kind of mental health and family health and good culture, if we want to call it that. It's also antithetical to good development. If you want to be a great athlete. So I think really, as much as you can, building bridges across sports and encouraging people. Every parent gets in this situation where their kid is playing soccer, and then there's that moment where, are you going to be on the travel team or not? And if you don't play winter soccer, you might not make high school team. And I don't know if there's a way to sort of change that or to really encourage people to bridge across sports. But I think that is completely worthy of exploring because it's not pushing us a good direction. It's making sports not fun, and it's taking. There's a lot of coaching out there that is, I don't know, I would call it sort of Nintendo coaching, joystick coaching, where coaches are just sort of doing that command and control authoritarian model, and that also cuts against it. So yeah, I'd send people to the Positive Coaching Alliance for a start, and for a second, kind of continue to build bridges between sports so that kids and families can enjoy what sport has to offer. Only a tiny percentage will ever play in the Olympics, but it can be a healthy influence on people's lives, on millions of lives.
Yeah. So, kind of going back to this, what were some things that you noticed when these folks came in to build that culture? Because the Spurs did not have that culture before Pop showed up, or at least not to the extent that it was. Maybe the owner started it. Pop gets a lot of credit for it. The Navy SEALs came out of a military, like you said, very command and control, where they sort of flattened out that hierarchical structure quite a bit. What were some things that were, you saw that were done intentional to, here's what I want this place to be, and here's how we're going to do it?
Yeah, it's a couple of things. One is that a lot of them emerged from a crisis. There's nothing like a crisis for giving an opportunity to sort of press pause and start over. Nothing like, in each of those cases, certainly in the case of Pixar and the San Antonio Spurs, and the Navy SEALs even had a crisis that helped create them. It opens up people's awareness and attention, and it gives leadership a chance to say, okay, we need to change. It's not just a nice idea or a slight change. People are very averse to change. It's very hard. We're naturally biased against change, and so having that crisis is actually a great opportunity. Even a lot of the leaders I talked to, for the book work, found themselves almost yearning for a crisis because it creates that opportunity for you to improve cultures and to help them. Success in itself is kind of hard. So that's one thing. The other thing I saw was a patience. There was one Navy SEAL commander I talked to who said it takes 7 years to really change a culture, which I don't know where he got that number. I think it was just a lot of his own experience, but I think it's in the right. That number is kind of accurate. It takes. People are very averse to change, and it takes a long time and a ton of repetition, and a ton of kind of creative. I want to call it almost like behavior design, where you constantly are looking. People think I can change the culture by having a few posters on the wall and by just being around, and the intentionality with which you can build systems. I would say that's a big part of it. When in each of these places there are group habits that their leaders put in. In Google, they have these all Friday meetings where everybody could come together and anybody could say anything, and they did. At Pixar, they have these meetings every day. They're called dailies, where anybody can comment on the footage that they produced the day before, and they do. And to have these little habits, and we talked about the SEALs AARs before, to have these small habits, and you almost can think of them, if you can conceptualize them as almost like a workout for the group. They're hard to have. They're kind of painful in a way, just like a workout is painful, and they have this benefit of creating group strength. And so what I saw is a lot of attention to those systems. Maybe it's, I work a little bit with the Cleveland Indians, and we've put a lot of attention in the past 5 or 6 years on building processes and building, okay, if we're going to develop our coaches and make our coaches better, what does that development system look like? What are the domains that we're going to help build people in? What resources can we offer them? So you can't just talk about this stuff. You actually have to build group habits, almost like your group is an athlete, and your group needs to have these moments where they stretch and feel pain, and you have to be, just like with a workout, you have to be patient. It's not going to happen in the first month. It's probably not going to happen the first year, and it sort of builds. I mean, the analogy that people use is that it's sort of like a flywheel, in that it's very hard at first, but as you get going, the momentum of that flywheel spins and propels it, and if you are, intentional and really patient, you can see really, really powerful results.
Very cool. Okay, I'm going to experiment here. I've not tried this before, so we'll see how it works here. I'm going to open up to questions and answers from anybody. There we go. So if you are dialed in, you can hit *6, and that will put you in the queue, and hopefully I will show up and figure out how to do it from here. What are some other things that, while we wait on some folks to maybe get in the queue, what are some other big takeaways that you had from this, and maybe some things that didn't get in the book just because of, constraints, what your publisher said, we only want this to be how many ever pages it ended up being? All right. Not seeing anybody in the Q&A here. Oh, sorry, Daniel, I muted you by accident with that. Yeah, sorry about that. I like I said, I've never tried this before, and I didn't realize it muted everybody there. The question I had was, what were some things that some takeaways that you had from your research, and maybe some things that didn't make it into the book?
Yeah, it's funny. There's one of the big ones has to do with, and I didn't really realize, until I got in it was just how tensions work in organizations. Like the importance of kind of naming the struggles that you've got. And the importance of really defining them. There's a natural tendency to kind of turn away from those tensions and turn away from like the real struggles you have. For example, there's a lot of organizations that have a lot of turnover, whether it's Pixar, whether it's, even a lot of sports organizations. And the good ones, though, were really, like the SEALs figured this out at some point. They realized, look, we're asking so much of these soldiers and asking so much of their families to get deployed for 6 months at a time. What can we do? They realized at one point that a lot of them were getting divorced, and that they were allowed to have problems at home because they were gone all the time. And they realized, no, wait a minute, we really have to support these families. So they started a program where before and after deployment, they would take the soldiers and their families to Disney World, and they would have these other sessions, these sort of retreats where they would talk about tools for communication when someone is away, or talk about coping with being a single parent, or talk about the challenge of being a deployed soldier coming home. So they really, one thing that I sort of realized, that I was surprised by was how much they focused on the whole person, and how much they focused on the whole person support group. Smart cultures aren't just successful because because they focus on the job. They really have that wider view where they look at the demands that they're putting on their people, and they try to support those people as they try to meet those demands, which deepens the connection, it's hard to do. It's hard to create those programs, but it really is appreciated so much that it ends up being incredibly worthwhile.
Okay, here we go. We're going to try this here. I'm going to open up the question here to, oops. I don't know who this is, but you should be unmuted now.
Hey, this is Aubrey Watts. I work in the coaching education department in the USOC. Thank you for speaking today. Can you guys hear me? Are we good with that?
You're good, Aubrey.
Nice to meet you.
Cool. Awesome. So one question I had, because I see it sometimes in our setting, is you talked about how, to change the culture, really you have to get the buy-in from the top. But when you are at the bottom, how do you go from bottom up and if the top doesn't see the problem yet, also without getting fired?
Yeah. What a great question. It's really a good one because I think it applies to a lot of people in a lot of different situations where you can see the need. And I'd say a couple things. I mean, you absolutely do need eventually to get the buy-in from the top. So that ends up being kind of a tactical challenge. One way to meet that challenge is to be oblique about your influence. For example, try to expose your leadership to other groups through idea exchanges, through field trips that embody that stuff. Put it in front of them over and over again. Put it in their become clear. That's one where you can't be completely direct. Sometimes you can be direct about it, but sometimes in an unhealthy culture, it's unsafe. to be direct about it. So be oblique about it, and constantly fill their windshield with images of cultures that you think have powerful lessons. You could even sneak a book onto their desk if there was such a book that talked about culture. You could, and the other thing I would say is that you could, culture ultimately is like the 15 feet around you, and even in a bad culture, it is totally possible to create these islands of great culture. If you focus on those immediate relationships, and if you build in a similar way, build kind of culture building habits in that smaller group. So that's the other thing I would say. Like, focus on the 15, 20 feet around you at all times. Maximize those interactions. And that can be kind of contagious because people can sort of look up and say, wait a minute, what is it about that group? We should clone that. And it becomes self-evident that there's a better way to do things, maybe. So, yeah, kind of, again, it takes a lot of patience, and it can be very difficult, but it has happened. I mean, there are plenty of examples of groups, and I tell a couple of the stories in the book. There's this little coffee group at Google that had a huge impact on the company. So finding those ways in your immediate area, and by being oblique with leadership around nudging them toward better paths.
So I anticipate that Aubrey is going to put Culture Code on Chris's desk any day now. So it'll be our secret. Yeah. Very good. Thanks, Aubrey.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're coming up close to the hour here. I don't have anyone else in the queue. Any parting thoughts? Just that those of us in the sports world, and we've had organizations that are certainly undergoing, a crisis now. Gymnastics certainly is at the forefront of that. Unfortunately, swimming's had some allegations come up. We've got, the Maryland football team, with some issues there, some allegations. What are some tips that you might give those of us who aren't at high levels in our sports organizations for implementing that?
Yeah, I think those crises are going to be opportunities to restart and to really embrace that opportunity, create a lot of clarity around that, around what's acceptable and what's good and what's bad. I mean, these are horrible things to go through, but they do have this advantage of creating a lot of clarity. The other large picture thought I had is that in sports, people get siloed. They falsely think because I work in this sport, I don't have much use for any other sport. That sport is different than mine. And just to harken back to that original meeting, gosh, it's been 10 years now, but to have all there is so much opportunity for idea exchanges, not just in your sport. You are teachers, and you're teaching teachers, and there's so much good information out there, whether it's looking up stuff on a great charter school system like KIPP, which has a wonderful teacher training program and a whole system, a whole sort of method and process that's all out there online, where they really have a clear, highly intentional way they go about developing teachers. Coaches are teachers, and we naturally sort of silo ourselves. And I think, to me, that's the biggest opportunity to sort of build bridges between sport to sport, but also build bridges out to the larger teaching community, where there's so much to learn, there's so much to get better at. So it's an exciting moment, I think.
Daniel, I got one question here that changing gears and put your brain back on the book you wrote, The Talent Code, that I think for a lot of people probably introduced you to them. I've read your books about the cycling world because I kind of come from that world. So Craig Jones asked, what, if anything, would you rewrite from the Talent Code now that is several years later?
I think in the Talent Code, I sort of spend a lot of time on Anders Ericsson's 10,000-hour rule, which at that time was really a wonderful way to draw attention to the importance of practice. At that time, when this book was published 10 years ago, there really that idea was new, fairly revolutionary. This idea that practice was that powerful. And now I'm kind of aware on how much that number has been misinterpreted, I think. And so I think I would probably dial back on that. I mean, there were actually sports programs. There was a soccer program, I think it was in Australia, where they actually counted the hours. Like, okay, we're going to have everybody do 3 hours a day for 300 days, and we'll get to 10,000 hours that way. I guess maybe it'd be 3,000 days, not 300 days. And I think that the idea that like you could just put an odometer and go practice mindlessly could not be further from the truth. I mean, there's a ton of fascinating stuff in motor learning about constraints, about verbal cues that I think is way more useful than any 10,000-hour rule. So I think that's what I would do. I'd probably put the focus more on what we now know is motor learning, what we knew then is motor learning, and less on this idea that it's about the time. It's not about the time. It's about the quality.
Well, and I've got one more question here for you too along those talent lines, but I'll also add in that if I plug things, if you go to the USA Fencing website in the coaches area, I did an interview, did a podcast with Anders Ericsson, and talking about the 10,000-hour rule, and it's definitely said, look, this is a very narrow thing, and he even admits there were some issues with that original data that they gathered, and I think David Epstein did a great job of sort of deconstructing that in the sports teaching for sure. So a couple more questions as they're popping in now. Maybe maybe we'll just travel back in time and talk about this. So Billy, that's my friend from USA Cycling, asked this question: can using the word talent around young athletes create a hindrance to their development by inundating the athlete with a false idea of identity through an overuse of the word talent?
That's awesome. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it depends on how you use it, and you can certainly say someone has their talent is for working hard, or their talent is for their, they have this. But yeah, I think it's a dangerous word. I think growth is a much better word, and I think progress is a much better word, and build is a much better word. When you talk about an athlete, if somebody has a great swing, you can either say, oh, they're so natural, they have such a natural great swing, or you can say, if it's a baseball player, you can say, oh, he's built himself such a great swing. Like, that's a slight change, but it's a hugely different metaphor and story that you're telling there. And so when I think sometimes that word, I don't think coaches always intend it to be perceived that way, but I think it does send that signal that when you say, oh, that kid is so talented, that's how you see that. You say that I was born that way. And instead, if you just shift it to say, man, that kid has built himself some skills. That is such a different way to say basically the same thing. And yeah, people progress. Not everybody's created equal. There are kids who show up and they're better, and they're stronger and they're bigger, and that's hormones in action. That's maturity in action. And there are differences in base levels of coordination. But treating them as if it's all that way is crazy. So find a different story to tell, and the word build is a good one.
Yeah, I like build as a different word too that's not kind of overused. And Billy, this makes me think of Carol Dweck's concept of the growth mindset and focusing on that hard work and effort you put in, not just wow, you just showed up and knew how to do this and whatnot. All right, got one more here. I got a question here, so go ahead. Oops, sorry. Somebody's in the queue here. Go ahead and ask your question. Identify yourself too.
Hey, this is Nadine Spina, and I'm also with the USOC coaching department. And I wanted to ask a little bit around, you had mentioned that Kerr uses tools that are appropriate for this generation. And I know that a lot of the coaches in my program have been asking, how do I connect with this new generation of athletes, the millennials and all of those? Do you have any insights around what is working better for, younger athletes these days? Because I don't believe that it's that different. But it seems like there's a perception that millennials are so different from, everybody else.
Yeah. I think on the baseline, I do agree with you. The human beings haven't changed that much. There are a few things, in the digital world that can help. They can help create connection. But ultimately, I think when I said he was using different tools, when when he became a coach, he flew around and visited each of his players in person. You know, that's a hell of a tool. It's a very simple tool, face-to-face contact. And some other stuff that he does is he really, creates these group habits around having fun together. He lets the players design chunks of practice. The other tool that he uses that I think is appropriate to this generation is just giving more ownership. There was that it was weird that it was a controversy because it's actually something that Coach Pop has done for years, where he would let the players run the huddle. They'd have a timeout, and Kerr would just not go over and let them handle it. The All Blacks do that. This idea of ownership, I think, is appropriate to this new, I'm going to call it a generation, but of giving ownership to players, I think is appropriate. It's not new, but it works. I think it works extraordinarily well, especially with a lot of athletes who maybe didn't have that opportunity as younger athletes. But the idea that a coach could call timeout and then never go over to the huddle during timeout and have the players figure it out. Pop does that about once a month during the season, and it's wonderful because the players have this moment of like, oh wait, nobody's telling us what we should do. We should figure it out ourselves, and they do, and they get a tremendous sense of appropriate ownership, power. They're the ones who are playing. They're actively solving problems together, that's the sign, to go back to that original image we started with, like a school of fish moving through a coral reef. There's no coach telling them what to do. You got to figure it out. And so those kinds of tools that tip them toward those moments, I think, are incredibly powerful.
Great. Thanks, Nadine. All right. Well, Daniel, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. We're approaching about an hour, and I want to thank you for taking the time out. I enjoyed the book. In fact, I went through and was starting to read it a second time, and unfortunately didn't get completely through it the second time. I started noticing things that I'd either missed the first time or just hadn't sunk in. So I would highly recommend folks, give it a read, put it aside for a while, and then maybe come back to it, and you'll pick up some new insights from it as well. So with that, I want to thank everybody who joined us today, and please tell your friends and colleagues. I'll send out email when this is posted on the various sites. And Daniel, hope to talk to you again. Maybe a quick question: do you have something in the pipeline that you're going to work on next, or are you taking a little breather after the Culture Code, or can you share that with us?
I am trying to figure out what that next thing is. I'm not really sure what it is. But, I just want to thank you for having me today. It's always fun to talk to coaches and coach educators, especially. I think you guys are in an incredibly powerful position to make good things happen. Now, I also want to thank the best coach educator one of the best coach educators I know, John Kessel of USA Volleyball, who connected us and made this happen.
Yes.
So thanks, John, and thanks, Sam.
Yeah, John, I think all of us look up to John, and I think he may be on the call. The list is pretty long here. But yeah, I want to thank him for certainly putting us in touch with one another. All right, so with that, folks, I'm going to sign off. Remember, if you want to join the live one tomorrow with Jessica Leahy, we're going to talk about the gift of failure and why failure is a good thing for kids and that we should embrace it. And so I'm looking forward to talking with her about her book as well. So once again, everybody, thanks for joining us, and see you next time.